Chapter 22. By Candlelight. The steady hum of the car lulled Margarita as she flew high above the earth, and the moonlight was pleasantly warm. Closing her eyes, she turned her face into the wind and thought nostalgically of the unknown riverbank she had left behind and sensed she would never see again. From the magical and miraculous events of the evening, she had already guessed who exactly she was about to visit, but it did not frighten her. The hope of reclaiming her happiness had rendered her fearless. She had little time to spend dreaming of this happiness in the car, however. Perhaps the rook was a good driver, perhaps the car was fast, but soon Margarita opened her eyes to see the dark woods below, replaced by the trembling lake of Moscow's lights. The black avian chauffeur removed the front right wheel of the car in mid-air, then landed the car in some completely deserted cemetery near Dorgomilovo. Leaving the unquestioning Margarita and her broom near one of the gravestones, the rook aimed the car straight into a ravine past the cemetery. It crashed loudly and was destroyed. The rook saluted politely, hopped atop the remaining wheel, and flew away. Immediately, a black cape appeared from behind one of the tombstones. A fang twinkled in the moonlight, and Margarita recognized Azazello. He gestured to Margarita, inviting her to get on her broom, himself mounting a long rapier. They took off, and several seconds later landed unnoticed near number 302B on Sadovaya Street. As they passed through the gateway, carrying the broom and the rapier under their arms, Margarita noticed a man in a cap and high boots skulking there, apparently waiting for someone. No matter how light their steps, the solitary man heard them and fidgeted nervously, wondering where the sound had come from. A second man, surprisingly similar to the first, was standing by the 6th entrance. Again, the same story. Steps. The man glanced round anxiously and frowned. When the door opened and closed, the man ran after the invisible guests and peeped through the doorway, but of course saw nothing. A third man, an exact copy of the second, and therefore the first, was patrolling the landing on the 3rd floor. He was smoking a strong cigarette, and Margarita coughed as she walked by. As if someone had pricked him with a needle, the smoker sprang up from the bench he was sitting on. Looking around nervously, he approached the banister and looked down. Margarita and her guide were already at the entrance to apartment number 50. They did not ring. Instead, Azazello opened the doors silently with his key. The first thing that astonished Margarita was the darkness surrounding her. It was impossible to see anything, like in a dungeon, and Margarita involuntarily clutched at Azazello's cloak, afraid of tripping over something. But then a tiny lamplight glimmered in the distance and began to approach. Azazello took the broom from Margarita as they walked, and it vanished in the darkness without a sound. They began to ascend a broad staircase, and it seemed to Margarita that it had no end. She was amazed at how this incredible, invisible, yet very tangible infinite staircase managed to fit in the hall of a regular Moscow apartment. But then the stairs ended, and Margarita realized she was on a landing. The little light was right next to her, and Margarita saw the face of the tall, dark man holding the lamp. Those who had already had the misfortune to cross paths with him in recent days would have recognized him instantly, even by the faint light of the lamp. It was Korovyov, alias Fagot. Korovyov's appearance had changed considerably, however. It was no longer a cracked pince-nez, long overdue for the rubbish heap, that reflected the flickering light, but a monocle, though also cracked. The whiskers on his insolent face were curled and waxed, while the blackness of Korovyov's appearance was explained simply by his tailcoat. Only his chest was white. The magician, choir master, sorcerer, interpreter, or hell really knows who, Korovyov, in other words, bowed and invited Margarita to follow him with a broad sweep of his lamp. Azazello disappeared. What a strange night, Margarita thought. I would have expected everything but this. Did they lose electricity or something? But the most amazing thing about this place is its size. How can it all fit into a Moscow apartment? It just can't. Though Korovyov's lamp gave off very little light, Margarita determined that she was in an absolutely colossal hall, and with a dark and seemingly endless colonnade as well. Korovyov paused beside a little bench, offered Margarita a seat, placed his lamp on some sort of pedestal, and leaned on it himself, assuming a picturesque pose.
"Allow me to introduce myself,"
Korovyov screeched.
"Korovyov! You are surprised at the lack of light? I suppose you were thinking cost-saving. No, no, no. Let any executioner, say one of those who will have the honour of kissing your knee later tonight, lop my head off on this very pedestal if it be so. Messiah simply doesn't like electric light, and we will turn it on at the last possible moment. And then, believe me, there'll be no shortage of it. If anything, it would be better to have a little less."
Margarita liked Korovyov, and his nonsensical rattling had a reassuring effect on her. "No," Margarita said, "what amazes me most is how all of it fits in here." She waved her hand, indicating the vastness of the hall. Korovyov smirked sweetly, and the shadows stirred at the corners of his nose.
"It's the most trivial thing of all," he replied. "Those well acquainted with the fifth dimension have no trouble expanding any space to the desired proportions. I will go a step further, dear lady, to devilish proportions. Though I, personally," Korovyov went on chattering, "have known people who, without any knowledge of the fifth dimension, or much of anything else for that matter, have managed to perform true wonders with respect to enlarging their space. For instance, I am told a certain man once managed to instantly turn his new 3-room apartment on Zemlyanoy Val into a 4-room apartment, without resorting to the fifth dimension or any other mind-boggling concepts. He merely divided one of the rooms with a partition. Thereafter, he exchanged the apartment for 2 separate places in different parts of Moscow, one with 3 rooms, the other with 2. You'll agree that adds up to 5. He exchanged the 3-room apartment for 2 separate 2-room apartments, and as you can see, became the owner of 6 rooms, scattered all over Moscow though they were. He was getting ready to perform his final and most brilliant coup, and placed an ad in the paper saying he wished to exchange a total of 6 rooms in various parts of Moscow for one 5-room apartment on Zemlyanoy Val. Sadly, his activity came to an end for reasons beyond his control. Perhaps he still has a room somewhere, but I assure you it is far from Moscow. Now there's a smooth operator, and here you are carrying on about the fifth dimension."
Though it was in fact Korovyov, and not Margarita, who had been carrying on about the fifth dimension, she laughed cheerfully at the story of the property swindler. Korovyov continued.
"But to business. To business, Margarita Nikolaevna. You are a very intelligent woman, and have already guessed who our host is, of course."
Margarita's heart thumped, and she nodded.
Well then, Korovyov spoke. "We're against any sort of deliberate omissions and secrecy. Every year, Messiah gives a single ball. It is known as the spring ball of the full moon, or the ball of 100 kings. All those people."
Korovyov grasped his cheek as if he had a toothache.
"Though I hope you'll see for yourself. So then, Messiah is a bachelor, as you must surely understand. However, he requires a hostess. You must agree that without a hostess—"
Korovyov spread his hands. Margarita listened to Korovyov, trying not to miss a single word, but her heart felt chilly, and the hope of regaining her happiness made her head spin.
"There is a tradition,"
Korovyov continued.
"Firstly, the hostess must be named Margarita, and secondly, she must be a native of the place where the ball is to be held. We travel, if you will, and are currently situated in Moscow. 121 Margaritas we found here, and, would you believe it?"
Korovyov slapped his thigh in desperation.
"Not a single one was suitable. Then, finally, a lucky twist of fate."
Korovyov grinned expressively, bowing from the waist, and again Margarita's heart turned cold.
"In short,"
Korovyov exclaimed,
"very short, will you agree to take this responsibility on yourself?"
"I will," Margarita said firmly.
"Done,"
Korovyov said, and raising his lamp added,
"Follow me, please."
They passed between the columns and finally emerged in another hall, which smelled strongly of lemon. Rustling came from the dark, and something brushed against Margarita's head. She flinched.
"Don't be afraid,"
Korovyov soothed sweetly, taking Margarita under the arm.
"Behemoth's contrivances for the ball, nothing more. And if I may be so bold as to give you some advice, Margarita Nikolaevna, do not be afraid of anything, anywhere. That would be unwise. The ball will be luxurious, I won't deny it. We will see persons who once held immense sway of power. But really, when one considers how microscopically small their abilities compared to the one whose entourage I have the honour of belonging to, it becomes quite amusing. I would even say pathetic. And besides, you two are of royal blood."
"Why royal blood?" Margarita whispered fearfully, pressing against Korovyov.
"Oh, my queen,"
Korovyov rattled on playfully.
"Questions of blood are among the most complex in the world, and if one were to ask certain great-grandmothers, especially those known to be particularly modest, one could discover fascinating secrets, my dear Margarita Nikolaevna. It would not be inaccurate to compare it to an intricately shuffled pack of cards. There are things that go beyond class barriers, even beyond state borders. A hint. One of the French queens, who lived in the 16th century, would have likely been very amazed had someone told her that many years later I would be leading her lovely great-great-great-great-granddaughter through a ballroom in Moscow. But look, we've arrived."
Korovyov blew out his lamp, and it vanished from his hands. Margarita saw a strip of light beneath a dark door ahead. Korovyov knocked quietly. Margarita grew so agitated that her teeth started chattering, and a chill passed down her spine. The door opened. The room turned out to be quite small. Margarita saw a large oak bed with dirty, crumpled sheets and a pillow. An oak table with carved legs stood in front of the bed, bearing a candelabrum with sockets shaped like bird talons. Thick wax candles burned in its 7 golden claws. A large chessboard with figurines of extraordinary craftsmanship lay next to it on the table. A low bench stood on a small, worn rug. There was another table with a golden chalice and a second candelabrum, its branches shaped like snakes. The room stank of sulphur and tar. The shadows cast by the lamps crisscrossed on the floor. Among those present, Margarita immediately recognized Azazello, now dressed in a tailcoat and standing at the head of the bed. Dressed up, Azazello no longer looked like the bandit that appeared before Margarita at the Alexandrovsky garden, and he bowed to her most gallantly. The naked witch, known as Hela, the same one who had embarrassed the Varieties' venerable bartender, and alas, the same one who had fortunately been scared off by the rooster on the night of the famous séance, was sitting on a rug by the bed, stirring a pot of something that gave off abundant sulphurous vapour. Besides these two, an enormous black monster of a cat was sitting on a high stool by the chessboard, holding a chess knight in his right paw. Hella rose and bowed to Margarita. The cat followed suit, jumping off the chair and shuffling his hind right paw. He dropped the knight and went climbing under the bed to retrieve it. Paralysed with fear, Margarita barely managed to perceive all of this in the treacherous shadows from the candles. Her gaze was drawn towards the bed, which was occupied by the one whom poor Ivan so recently tried to convince on the patriarchs that the devil did not exist. This non-existent one was now sitting on the bed. Two eyes bored into Margarita's face, the right, with a gold spark deep inside, penetrated to the very bottom of the soul. The left was empty and black, the narrow eye of a needle, an entrance to a bottomless well of darkness and shadow. Woland's face was skewed to one side, the right corner of his mouth tilted downward, and deep wrinkles cut through his long, balding forehead, parallel to his eyebrows. Woland's skin looked as though it had been sunburned for all eternity. Sprawling broadly on the bed, Woland wore only a long, dirty nightshirt patched on the left shoulder. One of his bare legs was tucked under him, while the other rested on the small bench. Hella was rubbing the knee of this dark leg with a steaming ointment. Margarita also made out a beetle, skilfully carved from some dark stone, hanging on a gold chain on Woland's exposed, hairless chest. The beetle had strange symbols on its back. A curious globe stood next to Woland's bed on a heavy pedestal, seemingly alive and lit on one side by the sun. The silence lasted several seconds. "He is studying me," Margarita thought, and tried to will her trembling legs to stop. Finally, Woland smiled and spoke, causing his sparkling eye to flare up. "Greetings, Queen, and please forgive my informal attire." Woland's voice was so low that it occasionally dissolved into a rough whisper. Woland picked up a long sword lying next to him, leaned down, and poked under the bed, saying, "Get out from under there, the game is cancelled, our guest is here."
"Under no circumstances,"
Korovyov piped anxiously over Margarita's ear in a prompter's voice. "Under no circumstances," Margarita began.
"Messiah?"
Korovyov breathed in her ear. "Under no circumstances, Messiah," Margarita said quietly but clearly, taking control of herself. Smiling, she added, "I beg you not to interrupt your game. I imagine chess journals would pay a pretty penny for the chance to cover it." Azazello gave a quiet grunt of approval. Staring intently at Margarita, Woland noted, as if to himself, "Yes, Korovyov is right. What an intricately shuffled deck of cards. Blood." He stretched out his hand and beckoned Margarita. She approached, her bare feet not feeling the floor. Woland placed his hand on Margarita's shoulder. It felt heavy as stone, yet hot as fire. He yanked her towards him and sat her down on the bed next to him. "Well then, since you are so charmingly considerate," he spoke. "Not that I expected anything else. Let us avoid pretense." He bent down again and shouted, "How long will this circus continue under there? Come out, you accursed buffoon!" "I can't find the knight," the cat replied from under the bed, in a choked and phony voice. "He ran off somewhere, and all I see is this frog." "Are you under the impression that you are on some fairground?" Woland demanded, feigning anger. "There are no frogs under the bed. Leave these cheap tricks for the variety. If you don't show your face at once, we'll consider your game forfeited, you damned deserter."
"Never, Messiah!"
bellowed the cat, and he reappeared from under the bed that same second, holding the knight in his paw. "Allow me to introduce," Woland began, but then interrupted himself. "No, I just can't stand this motley fool. Look at what he's done to himself under the bed." Meanwhile, standing on his hind paws, the dusty cat bowed to Margarita. He was now wearing a white bow tie, and a pair of ladies' mother-of-pearl opera glasses was hanging from a cord on his neck. Additionally, his whiskers had been gilded. "What's all this?" Woland exclaimed. "Why did you gild your whiskers? And why the hell would you need a bow tie if you haven't got any pants?"
"Cats do not wear pants, Messiah,"
the cat replied with great dignity.
"Or will you have me put on boots as well? Pussies in boots exist only in fairy tales, Messiah. But have you ever seen anyone attend a ball without a tie? I have no intention to become the subject of ridicule and risk being thrown out. We all decorate ourselves as best we can. You may assume this pertains to the opera glasses as well, Messiah."
"But the whiskers?"
"I fail to see,"
the cat countered dryly,
"why Azazello and Korofiov could powder their faces after shaving earlier today, nor how white powder is any better than gold. I powdered my whiskers, that's all. Now, had I shaved, things would have been quite different. A shaven cat would have been quite inappropriate 1,000 times, yes. But anyway—"
the cat's voice quivered resentfully.
"I see that I'm being picked on and that I'm facing a serious dilemma. Should I be attending this ball in the first place? What will you say to that, Messiah?"
The cat puffed up with indignation so much that he looked like he was about to burst. "Oh, the cheat," Woland said, shaking his head. "Every time he is losing hopelessly at chess, he starts chatting you up like a snake oil salesman on a bridge. Sit down at once and cease this verbal mudslinging."
"I shall sit," the cat replied, sitting down. "But I must refute your last point. My remarks are by no means mudslinging, contrary to what you have just said, and in a lady's presence, no less. Rather, they are a chain of tightly packed syllogisms, ones that will be appreciated by such great minds as Sextus Empiricus, Martianus Capella, or for all we know, Aristotle himself."
"The king is in check," Woland said.
All right,
the cat replied, and began looking at the chessboard through his opera glasses. "And thus, Donna," Woland turned to Margarita, "allow me to introduce my entourage. This clown here is Behemoth the cat. You have already met Korovyov and Azazello, and this is my servant Hella, quick, competent, and can render any service imaginable." Turning her greenish eyes towards Margarita, the beautiful Hella smiled, even as she continued to scoop up the ointment and rub it into Woland's knee. "Well, that's about it," Woland concluded, wincing as Hella squeezed his knee particularly hard. "As you can see, the company here is small, diverse, and open." He fell silent and began to turn his globe. It was so well made that its blue oceans ebbed and flowed, and the polar cap looked like real snow and ice. Meanwhile, confusion reigned on the chessboard. A seriously upset king, in a white mantle, was pacing round his square, throwing his arms up in desperation. Armed with halberds, 3 white mercenary pawns stared perplexedly at an officer who was waving his rapier and pointing forward, where Woland's 2 black knights stood on adjacent squares, white and black, mounted on 2 fiery horses, beating their hoofs on the board. Margarita was astounded and captivated by the fact that the chess pieces were alive. Putting aside his opera glasses, the cat gently prodded his king in the back. Despairing, the latter covered his face with his hands.
"Not doing so well, my dear behemoth,"
Korovyov said in a quiet, caustic voice.
"The situation is grave, but far from hopeless,"
Behemoth replied.
"Moreover, I am confident of my eventual victory. It is merely a matter of properly analysing the situation."
He conducted this analysis in a somewhat strange fashion, as it consisted of making strange faces and winking at his king.
"None of it seems to be helping,"
Korovyov noted.
"Ah!"
exclaimed Behemoth.
"The parrots have gotten loose just as I predicted."
Indeed, the noise of numerous wings came from afar. Korovyov and Azazello rushed out of the room. "Bah! To hell with you and your ballroom stunts," Woland grumbled, without turning away from the globe. As soon as Korovyov and Azazello left, Behemoth's winking intensified. Finally, the White King realised what was required of him. He suddenly pulled off his mantle, threw it down on the square, and ran off the chessboard. The officer put on the abandoned royal garments and took the king's place. Korovyov and Azazello returned.
"Lies as usual,"
Azazello growled, glancing at Behemoth.
"I thought I heard something,"
replied the cat. "All right, how long can this go on?" asked Woland. "Check."
"I must have misheard you, my maître,"
replied the cat.
"There is no check, and there cannot be."
"I repeat, your king is in check."
"Messiah,"
the cat replied in a falsely anxious voice,
"you must be tired. The king is not in check."
"The king is on G2, Woland said, without looking at the board.
"Messiah, I am mortified,"
howled the cat, an expression of horror on his face.
"There is no king on that square."
"What's that?" Woland asked in confusion and looked at the board, where the officer standing on the king's square was turning away and trying to cover his face with his hand. "Why, you scoundrel," Woland muttered pensively.
"Messiah, again I appeal to logic,"
the cat began, pressing his paws to his chest.
"If a player declares a king to be in check when the king has long since departed the board, the check is ruled to be invalid."
"Do you surrender or not?" Woland shouted in a fearsome voice.
"Let me think,"
the cat replied meekly, placing his elbows on the table and resting his head on his paws. He thought for a long time and finally said,
"I surrender."
"Kill the stubborn bastard," whispered Azazello.
"Yes, I surrender,"
said the cat,
"but only because I am unable to continue playing in an atmosphere of persecution by jealous rivals."
He rose, and the chess pieces climbed back into their box. "It's time, Hella," Woland said, and Hella disappeared from the room. "My leg is acting up, and now there's this ball." "Allow me," Margarita asked quietly. Woland looked at her intently and moved his knee towards her. The viscous liquid was as hot as lava and burned her hands, but Margarita began to rub it into the knee without wincing, trying not to cause any pain. "My entourage insists it's rheumatism," Woland said, without taking his eyes off Margarita. "But I strongly suspect this knee ache is a gift from a charming witch I once became closely acquainted with, back in the year 1571, in the Brocken Mountains on Hell's Chair." "Surely that could not be," said Margarita. "Rubbish. Another 300 years or so and it'll pass. I've been directed to numerous medications, but I tend to stick to my granny's old ways. The vile old lady has left me some amazing herbs, my granny. Tell me, by the way, do you suffer from anything? Is there any sorrow or anguish poisoning your soul?" "No, Messiah, none of that," Margarita replied cleverly. "And now that I am here, I feel quite well." "Blood is a great thing," Woland said cheerfully out of nowhere, and added, "I see you are intrigued by my globe." "Oh, yes. I have never seen such a thing." "A great little item. To tell you the truth, I don't like hearing the latest news on the radio. They are always reported by strange girls who cannot even pronounce place names properly. Moreover, roughly 1 out of 3 seems to have a speech impediment of some sort, as if they pick them out on purpose. My globe is far more convenient, especially since I require very precise information about world events. Take this piece of land, for instance, here by the ocean. Look how it fills with fire. War has started there. If you look closer, you will see the details." Margarita bent down to the globe and saw the little square of land grow larger and more colourful, turning into a relief map of sorts. Soon she saw the narrow ribbon of a river with a small settlement beside it. A pea-sized house grew to be as large as a matchbox. Suddenly and silently, the roof flew up in a cloud of black smoke, and the walls collapsed, turning the tiny 2-story box into a smoking pile of rubble. Looking even closer, Margarita saw a small female figure lying on the ground. A little child's arms spread out in a pool of blood beside it. "It's over," Woland said, smiling. "He had no time to sin. Abaddon's work is impeccable." "I'd hate to be on the side fighting this Abaddon," said Margarita. "Whose side is he on?" "The more I talk to you," Woland replied pleasantly, "the more I realize how intelligent you are. Let me allay your fears. Abaddon is unusually impartial and sympathizes equally with both sides. Consequently, the results for both sides are always the same." "Abaddon," Woland called quietly, and a thin man in dark glasses stepped out of the wall. For some reason, the glasses made such a powerful impression on Margarita that she cried out softly and hid her face in Woland's leg. "Oh, would you stop this?" Woland cried. "Modern people are so nervous." He slapped Margarita on the back so hard that her whole body rang. "Can't you see he is wearing glasses? Besides, Abaddon has never appeared before someone prematurely, nor will he ever. And finally, I am here, and you are my guest. I only wanted to show you." Abaddon stood perfectly still. "Can he take off his glasses for a moment?" Margarita asked, pressing against Woland and shuddering, but this time from curiosity. "That, however, is impossible," Woland said gravely, and waved his hand at Abaddon, who disappeared. "What is it you wish to say, Azazello?"
"Messiah," Azazello replied, "I would like to inform you that we have 2 strangers with us. A beautiful woman who keeps whining and pleading to be allowed to stay with her mistress, and, begging your pardon, her swine."
"These beautiful women certainly behave strangely," noted Woland.
"It's Natasha! Natasha!" Margarita exclaimed.
"Very well, then. Let her stay with her mistress. The swine goes to the cooks."
"For slaughter?" Margarita cried fearfully. "Please, Messiah, it is Nikolai Ivanovitch, the tenant from downstairs. There has been a misunderstanding, you see. She rubbed some of the cream on him."
"Please," Woland said. "Why in hell would anyone want to slaughter him? Let him sit with the cooks for a while, that's all I meant. Surely you'll agree I cannot let him into the ballroom."
"To say the least," Azazello added, and announced, "Midnight approaches, Messiah."
"Ah, very well." Woland turned to Margarita. "And so, after you." Allow me to thank you in advance. Don't get flustered, and don't be afraid of anything. Drink nothing but water, or you'll grow languid, and things will be difficult for you. It is time." Margarita rose from the rug, and then Korovyov appeared in the doors. Chapter 23. Satan's Grand Ball. Midnight was approaching, and they needed to hurry. Margarita saw everything through a haze. She remembered lots of candles and a bejeweled pool. When Margarita stepped into the pool, Hella, assisted by Natasha, doused her in a warm, thick, red liquid. Margarita felt a salty taste on her lips and realized that she was being bathed in blood. The crimson shroud was replaced by a thick, clear pink one, and Margarita felt dizzy from the scent of rose oil. Then Margarita was thrown on a crystal couch, and her skin was rubbed with large green leaves until it began to shine. The cat barged in and began to help. He squatted near Margarita's feet and began to rub the soles of her feet as if he were a street shoeshine. Margarita did not remember who made her shoes out of pale rose petals, or how they closed around her feet with golden clasps. Something pulled Margarita up and placed her before a mirror, and a royal diamond crown flashed in her hair. Korovyov appeared out of nowhere and placed a heavy necklace on her neck, bearing the image of a black poodle in an oval frame. The ornament burdened the queen immensely. The chain began to chafe her neck immediately, and the heavy image pulled her down. Nonetheless, something made up for the unpleasantness caused by the black poodle necklace. It was the deference now extended to her by Korovyov and Behemoth. "Alas, alas, alas," Korovyov muttered as he stood near the entrance of the room with the pool. "Absolutely necessary, nothing we can do. Allow me to give you a final piece of advice, my queen. The guests will be diverse characters, so very diverse, but you can't show anyone your preference, Queen Margot. Even if you don't like someone, I trust you won't show it on your face. No, no, that would be unthinkable. They will notice at once. You must learn to love them, my queen, love them, and the hostess of the ball will be rewarded 100-fold. One more thing. Don't forget anyone. At least a smile, at least a turn of the head if you cannot find time for words. Anything but lack of attention. They cannot bear it." Accompanied by Korovyov and Behemoth, Margarita stepped out of the pool room and into complete darkness. "Me, whispered the cat. "I'll give the signal." "Do it," Korovyov replied from the dark. "Ball!" The cat shrieked piercingly, and Margarita cried out and shut her eyes for several seconds. The ball engulfed her all at once in the form of light, sound, and smell. Korovyov took her under the arm, and Margarita found herself in a tropical forest. Red-breasted, green-tailed parrots perched and hopped on the lianas with deafening screeches of, "I am delighted!" But the forest soon ended, its steamy stuffiness giving way to the cool atmosphere of a ballroom with columns made of a yellowish, sparkling stone. Just as the forest before it, the hall was completely empty, save for naked Africans in silver headdresses standing at attention by the columns. Their faces turned greyish-brown with excitement when Margarita flew into the hall with her entourage, which now included Azazello. Here, Korovyov released Margarita's arm and whispered, "Straight ahead, towards the tulips." A low wall of white tulips appeared before Margarita, and beyond it she saw a sea of small shaded lights, full of white shirts and black tailcoats. Margarita finally identified the source of the ballroom sounds. The roar of trumpets came crashing towards her, and then the sound of soaring violins broke through it and washed over her body like blood. An orchestra numbering 150 men was playing a polonaise. A man in a tailcoat towered above the orchestra. Seeing Margarita, he grew pale, smiled, and then with a wave of his hand brought the entire orchestra to its feet. Without missing a beat, the orchestra stood up, and its sounds continued to pour over Margarita. The conductor turned away from the orchestra and gave a low bow, spreading his hands broadly to the sides. Smiling, Margarita waved her hand.
"Not enough, not enough," Korovyov whispered. "He won't sleep all night. Shout to him, 'Greetings, King of Waltzes.'"
Margarita shouted it, and was surprised at the strength of her own voice, full as a bell, as it carried over the howling of the orchestra. The man trembled with joy, and pressed his left hand to his heart, even as his right continued to wave to the orchestra with a white baton.
"Not enough, not enough," Korovyov kept whispering. "Look to the left, at the first violins, and nod so each man thinks you've recognized him in particular. There are none but world celebrities here. Look over there, at the first stand. It is Vuitton. Very good. Now, let's move on."
"Who is the conductor?" Margarita asked as she flew off.
"Johann Strauss,"
shouted the cat.
"And may I be hanged for Miliardo in that tropical forest if a finer orchestra has ever played at any ball. I invited it, and note, not a single one declined or called in sick."
The next hall had no columns. Instead, one set of walls was covered in red, pink, and milk-white roses, and the other in Japanese double camellias. Fountains hissed between the walls, and 3 pools bubbled with champagne. One was transparent violet, one ruby, and one crystal. Africans in crimson headbands dashed around the pools, filling flat cups with champagne using silver ladles. In a large gap in the pink wall, a man in a red swallow-tailed coat was bouncing around on a stage. An unbearably loud jazz band roared before him. As soon as the conductor saw Margarita, he bowed so low that his hands touched the floor, then straightened out and screamed, "Alleluia!" He slapped his knee once, crossed his arms, and slapped the other knee twice, then snatched a cymbal from the hands of the nearest musician and struck it against a column. Flying away, Margarita could see the virtuoso jazzman struggle against the polonaise blowing at Margarita's back, and the musicians crouched in comic terror as he hit them on the heads with his cymbal. Finally they arrived on the platform, where, as Margarita realized, Korovyov had first met her in the darkness with his lamp. Now, however, her eyes were being blinded by light pouring from clusters of crystal grapes. Margarita took her place and found a low amethyst column by her left hand.
"You may place your hand on it if you get too tired," whispered Korovyov.
A dark-skinned man placed a pillow embroidered with a golden poodle at Margarita's feet. Obeying someone's hands, she placed her right foot on it, bending her leg at the knee. Margarita tried to look around. Korovyov and Azazello were standing behind her in formal poses. 3 other young men, vaguely resembling Abaddon, were standing next to Azazello. Margarita felt a cold breeze coming from behind. Glancing back, she saw wine hissing from a marble wall behind her and collecting in a pool of ice. She felt something warm and furry by her left foot. It was Behemoth. Margarita was standing high up at the head of a grand carpeted staircase that stretched far below. Down there, so far away that she could have been looking through the wrong end of a telescope, Margarita saw a gigantic foyer with a truly enormous fireplace that could have easily fitted a 5-ton truck in its cold black mouth. Filled with painfully bright light, the staircase and the foyer were empty. The sounds of the orchestra came from far away. They stood there, motionlessly, for about a minute. "Where are the guests?" Margarita asked Korovyov.
"They'll come, my queen. They'll come very soon. There'll be no shortage of them. Frankly, I'd rather be chopping wood than receiving them all on this platform."
"Chopping wood?"
the garrulous cat picked up.
"I'd rather be a tram conductor, and that surely is the worst job in the world."
"Everything must be ready in advance, my queen."
Korovyov explained, his broken monocle glinting in the light.
Nothing is more nauseating than watching the first guest to arrive as he wanders about, unsure of what to do, even as his lawfully wedded shrew nags him quietly for having arrived first. Balls like that ought to be banned, my queen.
Most definitely banned,
confirmed the cat.
Less than 10 seconds until midnight,
Korovyov added.
It's about to start.
The 10 seconds seemed extremely long to Margarita. They seemed to pass, yet nothing was happening. But then a crash came from the giant fireplace below, and a gallows leapt out with someone's decaying corpse still dangling on it. The corpse fell from the rope, struck the floor, and became a handsome, dark-haired man in a tailcoat and patent leather shoes. A small, half-rotten coffin ran out of the fireplace, its lid swung open, and another corpse fell out. The handsome man ran up to it gallantly and offered his bent arm. The second corpse turned into a lively, naked woman in black shoes and with black feathers in her hair, and then both the man and the woman hurried up the staircase.
"The first!"
Korovyov exclaimed.
"Monsieur Jacques and his spouse. Allow me to introduce a most interesting man, my queen, a known counterfeiter, a traitor to his government, but a very decent alchemist. He is famous," Korovyov whispered in Margarita's ear, "for having poisoned the king's mistress. That doesn't happen to everyone, you know. Look how handsome he is."
Her mouth open, the pale Margarita watched the gallows and the coffin disappear in a side passage of the foyer.
I am delighted,
the cat bellowed right in Monsieur Jacques' face as the latter ascended the stairs. Meanwhile, a headless corpse with one arm missing appeared from the fireplace, struck the floor, and turned into a man in a tailcoat. Pale with excitement, Monsieur Jacques' spouse was already kneeling on one knee before Margarita and kissing Margarita's knee. "Ma queen," muttered Monsieur Jacques' spouse.
"The queen is delighted,"
shouted Korovyov. "My queen," the handsome Monsieur Jacques said quietly.
"We are delighted,"
wailed the cat. Smiling lifeless yet friendly smiles, the young men accompanying Azazello were already prodding Monsieur Jacques and his spouse aside towards the cups of champagne held by the Africans. The solitary man in tails was running up the steps.
"Earl Robert,"
Korovyov whispered to Margarita.
"Interesting as ever. Note how amusing, my queen, the reverse case. This one was a lover of the queen and poisoned his wife."
"We are pleased, Earl,"
Behemoth cried. One after another, 3 coffins fell out of the fireplace, each bursting and falling apart. A man in a dark mantle walked out and was promptly knifed in the back by the man following him out of the black hole. A muffled cry came from below. An almost fully decayed corpse ran out of the fireplace. Margarita shut her eyes, and then someone held a bottle of white smelling salts to her nose. Margarita thought she recognized Natasha's hand. The staircase began to fill up. There was now a man in tails on every step, seemingly identical to every other in the distance, and a naked woman beside each, distinguished only by the colour of her shoes and the feathers in her hair. A thin, modest woman, with humbly downcast eyes, hobbled towards Margarita, wearing a strange wooden boot on her left leg and a wide green band across her neck. "Who's the green one?" Margarita asked reflexively.
"A most charming and respectable lady,"
Korovyov whispered.
"Allow me to introduce Madame Tofana. She was quite popular among charming young Neapolitan women, as well as the ladies of Palermo, particularly those who had grown weary of their husbands. It can happen, my queen, that one grows weary of one's husband."
"Yes," Margarita replied in a hollow voice, even as she smiled at 2 men who had knelt before her, one after the other, to kiss her knee and her hand.
"And so,"
Korovyov managed to whisper to Margarita and simultaneously shout,
"A glass of champagne, Duke. I am delighted. Yes, and so Madame Tofana sympathised with these poor women and sold them a strange liquid in small bottles. The wife would pour it in her husband's soup, whereupon he would eat it and thank her for her kindness, feeling great all the while. In several hours, however, he would grow quite thirsty and retire to bed. And a day later, the beautiful Neapolitan lady who fed her husband the soup would be free as the breeze in spring.
"What's that on her leg?" Margarita asked, offering her hand tirelessly to the guests who had overtaken the hobbling Madame Tofana on the way up. "And why the green thing on her neck? Is it withered underneath?"
"I am delighted, Prince,"
shouted Korovyov, at the same time whispering to Margarita,
"A lovely neck, but a slight misfortune befell it in prison. That's a Spanish boot on her leg, my queen, and here is the reason for the band. When the prison guards learned that, thanks to her, some 500 ill-chosen husbands had left Naples and Palermo forever, they strangled Madame Tofana in a fit of rage."
"Oh, how happy I am, O Black Queen, that I am afforded this high honour," Tofana whispered in a nun-like voice, trying to lower herself to one knee. The Spanish boot restricted her movement. Korovyov and Behemoth helped her rise. "I am glad," Margarita replied, offering her hand to others in the meantime. A steady stream now flowed up the staircase. Margarita stopped noticing what went on in the foyer below. She raised and lowered her hand mechanically, baring her teeth in an identical smile for each guest. The platform was buzzing with guests' voices, and a sea of music flowed from the halls that Margarita had passed through earlier.
"Now, here is a rather boring woman."
Korovyov no longer whispered, but spoke loudly, knowing that no one would overhear him in the hubbub.
"She loves the balls, always looking for an opportunity to complain about her handkerchief."
Margarita caught sight of the woman Korovyov was pointing to among the ascending crowd. It was a young woman of about 20 years of age, with an incredibly beautiful figure, but with anxious and importunate eyes. "What handkerchief?" asked Margarita.
"There is a maid assigned to her," Korovyov explained. "Every night for 30 years the maid has placed the handkerchief on her night table. It is there whenever she wakes. She's tried burning it in the furnace and drowning it in the river, but nothing helps."
"What handkerchief?" Margarita whispered, raising and lowering her hand.
"A handkerchief with a blue border. Once, while she was working in a cafe, the owner called her into the cellar. 9 months later, she gave birth to a boy, carried him off into the woods, stuffed a handkerchief in his throat, and buried him in the earth. At her trial, she said she could not afford to feed the baby."
"But where is the owner of the cafe?" Margarita asked.
"My queen!"
The cat screeched suddenly from below.
"Allow me to ask, what does the owner have to do with anything? It was not he who suffocated the infant in the woods."
Without ceasing to smile and wave her right hand, Margarita dug the sharp nails of her left into Behemoth's ear and whispered, "If you ever interrupt the conversation again, you bastard." Behemoth squeaked in a manner decidedly unbecoming at a ball and gasped,
"My queen, the ear will get swollen. Why spoil the ball with a swollen ear? I was speaking legally. From a legal point of view, be quiet, be quiet. From this moment on, consider me a fish, not a cat, but please let go of the ear."
Margarita released the ear, and the woman's gloomy, importunate eyes appeared before her. "I am happy to be invited to the great ball of the full moon, Mistress Queen." "And I," Margarita replied, "am glad to see you. Very glad. Do you like champagne?"
"What are you doing, my queen?"
Korovyov screamed desperately but noiselessly in Margarita's ear.
"There'll be an awful jam."
"I love it," the woman said imploringly, and then began to repeat mechanically, "Frida, Frida, Frida. My name is Frida, O Queen." "Then get drunk tonight, Frida, and think of nothing else," said Margarita. Frida stretched out both her hands towards Margarita, but Korovyov and Behemoth took her deftly under the arms and she vanished in the crowd. A solid wall of people was now storming Margarita's platform from below. Nude female bodies rose among the tailcoats of the men. Tan and pale and coffee-coloured and black, they floated towards Margarita. The intense downpour of light made the precious stones play and dance and sparkle in hair red and black and chestnut and light as flax. And diamond studs shone on the chests of the men, as if someone had splashed them with droplets of light. Every second now, Margarita felt lips touch her knee. Every second she would stretch out her hand for a kiss. Her face stiffened into a frozen mask of welcoming.
"I am delighted," Korolyov sang monotonously. "We are delighted. The Queen is delighted."
"The Queen is delighted,"
Azazello intoned nasally behind her back.
"I am delighted,"
shrieked the cat.
"The Marquise,"
muttered Korolyov.
"She poisoned her father, 2 brothers and 2 sisters because of the inheritance. The Queen is delighted. Madame Minkina, how pretty she looks. A little nervous, though. Why burn the maid's face with curling irons? Of course one is liable to get murdered after that. The Queen is delighted. A moment of your attention, my Queen. The Emperor Rudolph, a sorcerer and an alchemist. Another alchemist, hanged. Ah, there she is. What a lovely brothel she kept in Strasbourg. We are delighted. Next, a Moscow dressmaker who we love for her inexhaustible imagination. She kept a shop and thought up a terribly funny thing. She drilled 2 holes in the fitting-room wall.
Did the ladies know? Asked Margarita.
Every single one, my Queen,
replied Korolyov.
I am delighted. This 20-year-old boy had strange ideas since childhood, an eccentric and a dreamer. A girl fell in love with him, and he went and sold her into prostitution.
A river flowed from below, with no end in sight. Its source, the giant fireplace, kept feeding it. An hour went by, and then another. Margarita noticed that the chain on her neck was growing heavier. Something odd happened to her hand. Margarita could no longer lift it without wincing. Korolyov's curious observations ceased to amuse her. All the faces looked alike, and sometimes blurred together, black and white and slant-eyed mongoloid, and the air between them seemed to quiver and run. A sharp, needling pain suddenly pierced Margarita's right hand, and, clenching her teeth, she placed her elbow on the pedestal. A rustling now came from the halls behind her, like wings beating against walls, and Margarita realized that untold multitudes of guests were dancing there. It even seemed to her that the heavy marble, mosaic, and crystal floors in the wondrous hall were pulsating rhythmically. Neither Gaius Caesar Caligula nor Messalina piqued Margarita's interest, nor did any of the other kings, dukes, cavaliers, suicides, poisoners, gallows birds, procuresses, jailers, cheats, executioners, informants, traitors, madmen, sleuths, or seducers. Their names became jumbled in her head. The faces merged into one giant ball, and only one face lingered painfully in her memory, framed by a truly fiery beard, that of Malyuta Skuratov. Margarita's legs were buckling, and every moment she risked breaking into tears. The worst pain came from her right knee that everyone had been kissing. It became blue and swollen, even though Natasha's hand appeared several times and wiped it with a sponge soaked in some fragrant substance. At the end of the 3rd hour, Margarita glanced downwards with utterly hopeless eyes and gave a happy start. The flow of guests was thinning.
Balls are the same everywhere, my Queen, Korolyov whispered. The wave will subside momentarily. We have to endure but a few more minutes, I swear. Here comes a group of Brocken revellers. They always show up last. Yes, it's them. 2 drunken vampires. Is that all? Oh, no, one more. No, 2.
The last 2 guests were climbing up the staircase.
Oh, this one's new,
Korolyov said, squinting through his monocle.
Oh, yes. Azazello once visited him over a drink of cognac and advised him how to get rid of a man he feared would expose him. and so he ordered his friend, who was indebted to him, to spray the victim's office walls with poison.
"What is his name?" asked Margarita.
"Why, to be honest, I do not yet know," Korolyov replied. "I'll have to ask Azazello."
"Who's that with him?"
"That is the man who so helpfully carried out his order. I am delighted,"
Korolyov shouted to the last two. The staircase grew empty. They waited a while longer to be sure, but no one else emerged from the fireplace. A second later, without knowing how she got there, Margarita found herself back in the small room with the pool. She burst into tears instantly from the pain in her arm and leg and fell right to the floor. Comforting her, Hella and Natasha dragged her again under the bloody shower, massaged her body, and Margarita reawakened.
More, Queen Margot,"
whispered Korolyov, appearing beside her.
"We must fly through the hall so the honoured guests do not feel neglected."
And once more, Margarita flew out of the room with the pool. On the stage, surrounded by the wall of tulips, a simian jazz band now raged instead of the Waltz King's orchestra. Holding a trumpet in his hand, a giant gorilla with shaggy sideburns stomped heavily as he conducted the orchestra. Arranged in a row, orangutans blew on shiny brass. Merry chimps with harmonicas sat on their shoulders. Two baboons with lion-like manes were playing grand pianos, only no one could hear them amid the roaring and squealing and crashing of saxophones, violins and drums in the hands of gibbons, mandrills and marmosets. On the mirrored dance floor, countless couples spun round as one, in the same direction, amazingly agile and clean in their movement, threatening to sweep away anything in their path. Live satin butterflies fluttered above the dancing hordes, flowers rained from the ceiling. Each time the electric lights dimmed, myriads of fireflies would light up in the capitals of the columns, and marsh lights would float through the air. Then Margarita found herself near an enormous pool surrounded by columns. A giant black statue of Neptune was spewing a broad pink stream from its mouth. An intoxicating scent of champagne rose from the pool. Unrestrained merriment reigned here. Laughing, the ladies threw off their shoes and handed their handbags to their escorts or to the Africans who were running around with towels in their hands. With a shout, the women performed swallow dives into the pool, and foamy columns of liquid shot up in the air. The crystal bottom of the pool was lit from below. Penetrating the thick wine, the light illuminated the silvery bodies swimming through it. Everyone left the pool completely drunk. Laughter rang and thundered under the columns as in a bathhouse. Only a single, completely drunk female face stood out from the mayhem, its senseless yet pleading eyes evoking one word. "Frida!" Margarita's head began to spin from the alcoholic fumes, and she was about to leave when the cat pulled a stunt that delayed her a few moments longer. Behemoth worked his magic on Neptune's mouth, and the rolling mass of champagne quickly drained from the pool with loud hissing and roaring. Instead of the sparkling, playful wine, Neptune began to disgorge a dark yellow liquid. Screaming and hollering, "Cognac!" the ladies dashed away from the pool to the safety of the columns. In several seconds the pool was refilled. Spinning 3 times in mid-air, the cat tumbled into the rolling waves of cognac. He climbed out snorting, his bow tie limp, the gilding from his whiskers gone, and his opera glasses likewise missing. Only one woman dared follow Behemoth's lead, the clever dressmaker from before, along with her escort, an unknown young mulatto. They both dived into the cognac, but then Korolyov took Margarita under the arm, and they left the bathers. Margarita thought she saw mountains of oysters in vast stone basins float by underneath. Afterwards, she flew over a glass floor with rows of infernal furnaces burning underneath it, diabolical chefs in white garments dashing between them. Thoroughly disoriented, she saw dark dungeons lit by dim lamps, where girls served meat sizzling on hot coals, where everyone drank to her health from large mugs. She saw polar bears playing harmonicas and dancing a Russian dance on a stage, a salamander magician who could not be harmed by fire, and for the second time her strength began to wane.
"One last exit,"
Korovyov whispered anxiously.
"and we are free."
Escorted by Korovyov, Margarita returned to the ballroom. The dancing had stopped, however, and the immense crowd of guests had gathered by the columns, leaving the centre of the hall empty. Margarita did not remember who helped her onto the platform that appeared in the empty space. As soon as she ascended it, she heard a clock somewhere strike midnight, even though midnight had long since passed by her estimation. At the last stroke of the clock, silence fell upon the crowd. Then Margarita saw Woland again. He walked, surrounded by Abaddon, Azazello, and several dark young men resembling Abaddon. Margarita saw that another platform had been prepared for Woland opposite her own, but he did not make use of it. Margarita was astounded that Woland had made this last great appearance at the ball looking exactly as he had looked in the bedroom. The same dirty, patched shirt hung on his shoulders, and worn bedroom slippers were on his feet. Woland had an unsheathed sword, but he leaned on it as if it were a cane. Limping, Woland stopped near his platform, and Azazello appeared immediately before him, carrying a tray. The tray bore a severed human head, with its front teeth knocked out. The silence continued, interrupted only by a distant ringing that sounded like a doorbell, somewhat puzzling under the circumstances. "Mikhail Alexandrovich," Woland said quietly to the head. The dead man's eyelids opened, and Margarita shuddered when she saw that the dead face had living eyes, full of consciousness and suffering. "It all came true, did it not?" Woland continued, looking into the eyes. "You were decapitated by a woman, the meeting never happened, and I am living in your apartment. These are facts, and a fact is the most stubborn thing in the world. But now let us concern ourselves with what happens next, not with some long-accomplished fact. You have always been a zealous proponent of the theory that upon removal of the head, all life ceases in a man, that he turns to dust and vanishes into the void. I am glad to inform you here, in the company of my guests, even though they serve as proof of a wholly different theory, that your opinions are both clever and well-founded. One theory is as good as another, however. For instance, there is a theory that everyone shall receive exactly what he believes in. Let it be so. You will depart into non-existence, while I will happily drink to the joy of existence from the fine cup you will make." Woland raised his sword. The flesh of the head blackened and fell away in pieces, the eyes vanished, and soon Margarita saw a yellowish skull on a golden stand, with emeralds for eyes and pearls for teeth. The top of the skull swung open on a hinge.
"One moment, Messiah,"
said Korovyov, catching Woland's inquisitive glance.
"He will appear before you presently. I can hear the creaking of his polished shoes in this deathly silence. I can hear the ringing of the glass he has just set down on the table, having drunk the last champagne of his life. Here he is."
A lone, new guest stepped into the hall and headed towards Woland. Outwardly, he looked no different from the numerous other male guests, except for one thing. Even from far away, he was visibly shaking with agitation. Red spots burned on his cheeks, and his eyes darted around in alarm. The guest was, quite naturally, dumbfounded. Everything he saw shocked him, and particularly Woland's dress. However, the guest was received with the utmost courtesy. "My dearest Baron Mikhail," Woland said, smiling amiably to the guest, whose eyes were practically popping out of his head. "Allow me to introduce," Woland turned to the other guests, "the most esteemed Baron Mikhail, a member of the Entertainment Commission responsible for introducing foreign visitors to the capital." Margarita froze, for she had recognized Mikhail. She had seen him in several Moscow theatres and restaurants. Hold on, thought Margarita. Has he died too, then? But her question was resolved straight away. "This dear Baron," Woland continued, smiling happily, "was so charming as to call me as soon as he heard of my arrival in Moscow, offering his services with regard to his speciality. That is, showing me the local sights. Naturally, I was happy to invite him here." Margarita noticed that Azazello had passed the tray with the skull to Korolyov. "Oh, by the way, Baron," Woland suddenly said, lowering his voice intimately, "I have heard rumours of your incredible curiosity. They say that, coupled with your equally impressive talkativeness, it has begun to attract quite a bit of attention. Moreover, wicked tongues have already let slip the words stool pigeon and spy. And finally, there are speculations that all of this will lead you to a most unfortunate demise no more than a month from now. Thus, to save you all this torturous waiting, we have decided to come to your aid, taking advantage of the fact that you invited yourself here with the explicit purpose of eavesdropping and spying as much as possible." The Baron grew paler than Abaddon, who was exceptionally pale by nature. And then something odd happened. Abaddon stood in front of the Baron and removed his glasses for an instant. At the same time, a flash and a soft clap came from Azazello's hand, and the Baron began to fall over backwards, crimson blood spraying from his chest onto his starched shirt and waistcoat. Korolyov filled the cup from the pulsating stream and handed it to Woland. The Baron's lifeless body was already lying on the ground. "I drink your health, ladies and gentlemen," Woland said softly, and raised the cup to his lips. A metamorphosis took place. The patched shirt and worn slippers vanished, and Woland appeared in a black chlamys with a steel sword on his hip. He quickly approached Margarita, raised the cup, and ordered, "Drink." Margarita grew dizzy and swayed, but the cup was already at her lips, and voices she did not recognize whispered in both her ears. "Don't be afraid, my queen. Do not be afraid, my queen. The blood has long since vanished in the earth, and grapevines grow where it was spilt." Without opening her eyes, Margarita took a drink. A sweet current ran down her veins, and her ears started ringing. She thought she heard the deafening crowing of roosters and a distant march. The crowd of guests began to lose its form. The men and women turned to dust. Decay took over their bodies before Margarita's eyes, and a sepulchral stench began to flow from them. The columns fell apart, the lights extinguished, the halls shrank, and the fountains disappeared along with the tulips and the camellias. All that remained was all that there had ever been, a modest living room that once belonged to the jeweller's wife, and a strip of light falling from a half-open door. Margarita walked through it.